In this video, we're going to create a user profiles app where a user can register an account, log in, and edit some information that they've stored in their profile. Hi, this is James from Junior Developer Central, and welcome to this tutorial about creating a user profile app. And we're going to be using Express, Mongo, and Node to actually create this user profile application. If you have a second, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and for future tutorial updates. Okay, before we get started, I'm just going to give you a quick demo of what the application will roughly look like when we're finished. So we're here on the home page at the moment, and I can go to register an account. And if I just enter in a username and a simple password, when I click register, it should tell me that the account is now registered. So I can go to the login page now. And if I enter the same credentials again and click login, you see I'm taken to a page where I can edit some information about this particular logged in user. So I can just assign myself a name. And if I put in my GitHub handle, my Twitter handle and Facebook handle, and then just click update. Now, when I actually go and view the profile for this user, you can see all that information is then displayed. And this route is actually publicly available, so anyone can access this. They don't need to be logged in to see it. Just happen to be at the moment. And if I try and access someone who doesn't actually exist, you'll see we get a user not found message. And finally, we've just got the ability to log out of the system as well when we've finished editing our data. And when we go back to the home page, you can see that the recently registered users are then displayed on the home page for other users to see. So that's it in a nutshell. It's just some basic CRUD operations, and as I said, we're using Mongo, Node, and Express for this framework. So let's get started by actually creating our project from scratch, and then you can see how this is all put together. So if I go over to my terminal and just stop that application from running, I'm just going to go and create a new Express application using the Express generator. And I'm going to be using the handlebars templating system for this application. So just --HBS should do that for us. And I'll just call the project user profiles. And the Express generator does its thing. And if we navigate into that folder now and just do an npm install just to get all the dependencies ready for us. And that can take a few seconds, so I'll just pause the video for a second while that installs. So once the Express dependencies are installed, I'm actually going to install a couple of other things as well, just to make our application a bit easier to use. So the first thing is we're going to need the MongoDB client to actually connect to our MongoDB database. We're going to be using Passport for our authentication mechanism. And the actual strategy that we're using is the Passport local strategy, which basically means we're going to save all of our data into a local database rather than using OAuth or some other kind of social login. And we'll also need to save that data in a session, so we'll install the Express session package. And finally, those messages that were being displayed when the user logged in or registered are going to be provided to us by the Connect Flash package. So I'll just go ahead and install those now. And again, I'll pause the video while those install and come back in just a second. Okay, so with all of those installed, I'm actually going to just open up Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to head over to the app.js file, which is the main file that handles a lot of the Express framework. And we're going to do a few things here. We're going to import some dependencies that we just installed a second ago, and then we'll connect to the MongoDB database. So the first thing I'm going to do is up here, after we've imported all of the main Express framework dependencies, is let's get a reference to the Mongo client. Which is what we installed first on the command line, which is the MongoDB library. And we actually want to get a property inside of there called the Mongo client. We'll use that in just a second to actually connect to the database. The other thing we're going to need is Passport. So let's require Passport. And also we're going to need the strategy, the local strategy that we imported as well. So let's just call that a variable, just assign it to a variable called strategy, and it's passport local and dot strategy. Again, we're kind of accessing a property within inside that module. And the other thing we're going to need as well is the session stuff at the moment. So let's just save that in a variable called session. And that was the Express session module we imported. And finally, we'll also get a reference to the Flash package that we installed too, which was Connect Flash. So with those dependencies imported into this file, let's actually connect to our MongoDB database. And we'll just put that just after we've got a reference to the actual Express app itself and save that in a variable called app. And you'll see why that's important in a second. So for the Mongo client that we've just imported, you can see there's various different methods, including connect. So that's a good one to use for this. And we want to connect to a particular URL. It's a MongoDB specific URL, and I'm just going to set that to localhost for the moment. Of course, if you're using a different provider or when you actually deploy this, you might want to set that to something else. So that connect function actually accepts a callback as its second parameter, and that is an error first callback, so we first receive the error if there is any, and then if that's not the case, if it's successful, we actually get a client object which allows us to actually interact with the MongoDB database. So let's first of all check if there's an error. And if there is, we kind of want the application to just stop, so I'm just going to throw that error. So it will just stop the whole Express framework from running then. And if we don't get an error, what we'll do is we'll get a reference to the DB, and we do that from the client object, which is passed in as the second parameter. And I'm just going to get a reference to a database, and I'll call this user profile. This doesn't exist in the MongoDB server that I'm running at the moment, but it will actually create it at this point, so we don't need to really worry about that too much. And the other thing we want to do is actually get a table or collection, as it's referred to within a MongoDB app. And that collection, we're going to actually call that users. And again, this doesn't exist, but that will actually create it for us using that command. And when we've actually created that collection and got a reference to it, we're going to save it into something called app.locals.users and actually assign it that value that we've just created. And the reason for that is, if we didn't include it into our application, we'd actually need to use this connect function in various other different parts of the application that we're building, and that's quite wasteful. We only want to really connect once and get one reference to the collection. So with that done, we can move on to actually configuring the passport setup. So this will actually be the mechanism that will actually log users into the system and will actually protect particular routes that we're going to be creating. So for instance, we're going to want to make sure that the ability to edit a profile is only available once you're actually logged in. So we start off by actually saying that we want to use Passport's local strategy, and we do that by the Passport object that we've imported. We tell it we're going to use a new strategy, and the new strategy is just going to be an instance of the local strategy object that we've already imported, and we actually just pass that in a function where we actually do the checking of whether the user is logged in or not. So straight away I can get a reference to the user's collection simply by accessing what we just set up a moment ago, the app.local.users collection, and I'm going to call the find one function on there. So this is a MongoDB specific query that will find one particular record because we're only logging in one user at a time. And within that, I'm actually just going to pass in the username. So the username is provided to us in the callback for the new strategy. So Passport does all that handling of getting the username for us. And again, if we actually manage to find the user, assuming we don't get an error, I'm just going to check if we do get an error there. And we'll return the done, which is actually a callback. When the passport strategy has finished, we need to actually call back with some data. So if we got an error, we're going to just return that back. And if there's no user data found, we're actually just going to return the callback again. And this time we'll pass it back a value of null because there's actually no error, but there's no user either, so we'll pass back a value of false. Then we actually need to check if the user is actually provided the right password. So let's just say if the user.password does not equal the password that has been provided when the user has tried to log in. So if that's the case, we'll do the same thing again. Oops, we'll just say done, null and false, there's no user found. And then also at this point we can probably say that the user is actually logged in. We could do with some other checks if we needed to, but otherwise we can just say there's no error and we'll return the user object. So that will be all of the user information that's come back from the MongoDB database. So one thing here, we probably don't want to be storing the passwords in plain text. This password that the user has entered when they tried to log in will be in plain text, but we don't actually want to store it in the database that way. So let's just create a quick utility to actually hash the password. And I'll just create a new folder just to store that in. So if we want to create any more utilities, we can put them in there. I'll just call this one auth. And we could import another module to do this, like such as the bcrypt module, which is quite popular for hashing passwords. But just to keep it simple for this example, I'm just going to use the built-in Node crypto library, and I'll create a function called hash password, which just accepts some plain text as a variable. And then what I'll actually do is return the crypto module create HMAC. So this is basically creating a encrypted version of our plain text. And we could also put a different key in there. For example, we could actually get it from our environment variable or something, but again, just to keep it simple for this example, we'll just put it there. Let's actually update that with the plain text and then provide the digest. So this is like the hashed value once it's been processed. So that should be good enough for just hashing a password as we come out. And let's export it from this module. So now back in our app.js file, what I can actually do here is say auth utils require, and it's a local file, so utils auth. And when we actually check the password when the user's logging in, so the password here on the left that's been retrieved from Mongo will actually make sure that's encrypted, but we need to compare it to the plain text password. So auth utils hash password, and pass it that plain text that the user's provided when they're logging in. So that's the strategy, the local strategy that we're setting up for Passport. But there's another thing we need to do with Passport to make sure the user data is available throughout the session, and that's to serialize the user information. So whereas Passport's giving us an object, we actually need to just store it in the session as text. So we'll serialize the user, and we get the user and another callback. And inside there, we'll just call back and pass value of null. I'm just going to store the user ID. So in MongoDB, it will be _ID is the reference to the user in the database. And then passport deserialize user. There we go. That accepts ID and done. And we'll call back again from there with null and just pass back the ID as an object. So that's all we need to do for Passport, but we do need to do a bit more configuration in terms of registering the session. So let's just go down here, and after we've declared all of our static paths, etc., let's just say app use and session, which was the Express session module that we imported before. And inside there, we'll just pass a few different properties. So we would normally set a session secret, which again could be coming from an environment variable if we're going to deploy this to production. And a couple of other sort of mandatory fields that you need to fill out. So resave is false, and save uninitialized is also false. And with that set, we can actually then initialize Passport on the application too. So app.use passport.initialize. That's a function. And also the session for Passport as well. So passport.session. So this is all fairly boilerplate for a lot of the Express application. And also the Flash, the Connect Flash package will also make sure the application is set up to use that as well. So there's just two more things before we're finished with the app.js file. What I will actually do is put a bit of middleware into the routing of Express here. Let's just set up the function. And what I'm actually going to do is put a value into the response, which is then going to be passed back to other parts of the middleware routing. And I'm just going to set a variable called logged in on that, so it's accessible to all of the routes that we're going to be configuring. And I'm actually just going to set that to the value of is authenticated on the request object. So this is something provided by Passport that will tell us whether the user is actually logged in or not, and that's going to be really handy because we've got a reference in all of our routes to say whether the user is actually logged in. So that's going to be useful when we're trying to actually put a logout button as well to check whether the user's logged in. And the other thing I will just do before we leave this is I'm just going to put it back. Where's the handlebar stuff? I found that the handlebars partials don't seem to get registered correctly when we're using the Express generator. So I'm just going to say hbs.register partials. So this is registering the directory for the partials where they're going to be found. And that'll just be, if I can spell, path.join, whatever directory name we're in, and then views partials. And I do actually need a reference to HBS because that actually isn't available to us at the moment. So just create that as a variable up here. So handlebars is actually imported as a dependency into Express by default. So that'll just make sure that the partials can be found in /views /partials. Okay, so what we're going to move on to next is actually something a bit more visible. So we've done all the setup, but we need to actually start creating some routes that Express will start serving some pages on. So let's head over to our routes folder, and I'm going to create a new routing file called auth.js. And in here we need to import a few different bits and pieces. So we need to get a reference to Express. So we need that for various things. And also let's get the router. And I'm also going to import some things that we've already created as well. So the auth utils, we're going to find that useful in just a second. So that's in utils auth. And also we need passport here too. And finally we're going to get the, actually, we don't need the Flash module here actually, so we'll just leave that as it is. So let's create some routes for logging in and registering. So first of all, a get route for login, and oops, missed off the queue there, rec res and next. We don't need to forward the middleware anymore from here, but it's just useful to have it. And what we'll actually do here is just get a reference to the Flash messages, if there are any, from the request object. So that's again something that the Connect Flash module provides to us. And we'll also render a template just called login and pass it those messages if they exist. So that's pretty much all we need for login. It's just a simple thing. You'll see how the redirect works in a second when we get to that point. So this is what we will be posting our data to. So we'll just post it to the login endpoint as well. And let's just set up the callback for that. Okay, so we're going to actually make sure that this is calling the passport strategy that we created a moment ago, and we do that by passing it into the actual function call. And the function we're actually going to pass into that is authenticate, based on the passport object, and obviously it's the local strategy that we created. And I'm going to create a couple of extra properties to pass into that as well. So if we actually get a login failure, we want to redirect the user to somewhere. So let's set the failure redirect property here to, let's say, auth. We want to go back to the login page basically, don't we? So auth login. Let's split this up onto different lines so we can see that. Oops. And the other property I'm going to pass in as well is the failure flash message, which is just a custom error message when the user fails to log in. So we'll just say something like wrong username or password. Okay, so don't forget our comma there. So with that in place, basically this means that when data is posted to the login endpoint, the passport authenticate function will call, and if it's all good, we can actually then redirect the user to an endpoint just called users, and that'll be where we edit the user's profile. But if not, we're actually going to redirect back to the login page. And with that in place, we need to actually get some registration as well. So let's create a registration endpoint and just call that register. And recres next for our callback. And we might get error messages on this as well, so let's get the flash messages out from the request object. And let's render the register template. There we are. So simple again, same as the login page. So what we actually need to do is create a post endpoint which the user will post their registration data to when they're creating a new account. So we'll just say post register, and with our callback inside there, what we're going to do is say get the parameters from the body. So the registration parameters we'll say are equal to the request body. So that will be the form data that's passed in via a HTML form, which we're going to create in a moment. And we also want to get a reference to our users collection for MongoDB. So again, this is why it's useful to set it up on the app.locals variable so we can access it in different parts of our application. And so we want to hash the password before we save it into the database. So I'll just create another variable called payloads, which is what we're basically going to assign to the database collection. And we're going to create two properties, the username. So in the registration params, we're going to extract the username. This is also quite useful for stopping loads of random data being inserted into the MongoDB database. We only want these two properties. And password, so we've got our auth-utils module imported, and we're going to hash the password again, and that's based off the registration params password property. Okay, so with the payload created, we can actually insert that into the MongoDB database. So users.insert one this time instead of find one, and we just literally pass in the payload object that we've just created and just check for an error. So if there is an error, we don't really want to crash the whole application as we did at the start when the MongoDB client didn't connect. We actually want to display a message to the user. So this might be a bit trivial because there could be many other errors that occur here. But what we're going to say is request.flash error, and if an error does occur, it's probably likely that we've got a conflict in the database. We'll set up an index on the collection in a moment so that you can only have one username or you can only have unique usernames in the collection. So the error that we're going to get is most likely going to be that the user account already exists. But that is kind of simplifying it a little bit for this example. If we don't get that error, then everything should have been okay. So we can then flash the user to say the user account was registered successfully. Okay, so that's that setup. And once the actual data has been stored in the MongoDB collection, let's just redirect the user back to the registration page so they can see those flash messages. So that's it for registration. We've got a template ready to go and also the endpoint to create it. Let's just, before we leave our auth routing, let's just create a logout page as well. So let's just render, actually we don't need to render a template as such. We can just create an endpoint that when the user hits it, it actually just destroys their session. So there's a couple of ways to do that, but I'll just say rec.session.destroy. So any user data that's stored in the session will be removed, and we can just redirect them to the home page. And so before we finish this, we mustn't forget to actually export the new routes that we've created as well. So we just do module exports is equal to router, which is where we've set up all the routes. And also let's go back to our app.js file And you'll see here there's a couple of routing files that have already been imported. Let's import ours as well. So we'll just call it auth router as the variable name. And we're in the same folder, so it's roots and auth. And we also need to add it to the Express app as those roots too, which we see down here. So we'll add it in as auth because I think all of the other references we've already created are using that namespace, and we'll just use auth router for that. Okay, with that set up, then let's actually go and create some of those templates that we were talking about in the roots a moment ago. So we need two. We need one for login, and we call the template login. So let's say login.hbs, and also we need another one for register.handlebars as well. And let's start with the registration one as we're here, and we'll just put a title up. So register a new user, and we're going to create a form. And the action is going to auth register, so that's that post endpoint that we created a moment ago. So let's make sure we're sending post data. And let's use some Bootstrap formatting for this. We'll import that in a moment. So a form group, and we'll have a label. And we want to accept a username. So that'll be the first field that we're filling in. And let's just set this up as a form control for Bootstrap. And let's give it a name of username. And also for our labels purposes, let's set up a username ID as well. So that's our first one. And we also want another form group. So this will be for the password. So set that up. And same thing again, set the input type as password, and class of form control, name is password, and our ID is password too. Okay, and the final thing we need is a registration button, obviously. So let's just create a button. Oops. And we'll give that a class of btn primary. So those are some Bootstrap classes, and we'll just say register. And the other thing we might want to do as well is provide a link if they've already got a registered user, so that they can go straight to the registration page. So let's set up a paragraph tag here and just say, or you can log in here too. So the login template is going to be found at auth login. So let's just direct them there. If you already have an account. There we go. So let's do the same thing for our login page as well, and we can pretty much copy the whole template across to that because it's pretty much identical. So we'll say login. We don't need to say that. Oops. And this time we're actually just going to the login route, and it's username and password again, so that's fine. And just log in, or we'll just say register an account. There we go. So we're pretty much ready to actually start using this. One thing we'll probably just do is create the flash messages to be displayed on the login failure and success, or the registration success. So let's create that partials folder, and I'm going to create a partial inside there called messages. And it's a handlebars file again. So inside there, we're just going to put messages actually receives arrays of messages, because you might get more than one notification come up. So we can actually loop through each of those. But there's properties for errors and also success messages. So we'll just set that up now. So for each error that we've got, we'll actually just put a new div with a class of alert. And we'll use the Bootstrap alert danger color message. And because we're looping through an array, The value for each item will be contained in this. So that's all we need to do there. And we can pretty much just copy that there, except what we'll do is just change the alert danger to alert success, and we'll save that. So that's all we need to do for our partial, and that will just allow us to use that in the login and registration pages as well as other parts of our app. So to include the partial, we'll just say messages, and we'll copy that into the registration page as well. And what we'll actually do is just get a link to Bootstrap as well, because we want to include that within our application. And I'll put that inside the layout handlebars template, and I'll just put it just before we actually call our own styles as well. So we should be pretty much ready to go to actually log in and register some users. So let's bring up a terminal, and inside there we're actually we'll use nodemon just to keep this running. npm start it, and fingers crossed we shouldn't have any errors. Yeah, looks good. Okay, so we'll go back to our local host. So that was the previous application running there. Oh, and something's not running there, so we've actually got a typo in there somewhere. So yeah, it's in the auth router in app.js. So let's just go and find that there, line 17. Oh, yeah, that's the fella. Let's save that. Nodemon's restarted. Refresh the page. And we have the Express homepage. So yeah, we're good. So we can't see anything at the moment, but we've created our routes at register and login. So let's go to the registration page. And we've got nothing there. So oh yeah, it was auth register, wasn't it? That was the namespace for the routes. So that makes sense. Okay, so messages is not defined. So that was in our auth.js at 19. So let's have a look at that. Auth.js. Forgotten to put something in there. And we've got another typo. So instead of messages, we've got message. So let's restart the application and we'll go again. And there we go, we've got our registration page. There we go. So let's try creating a new user. I'll just call it James and password of password, and click register. And yep, we've got our flash message saying we were registered successfully. And let's also try the login as well. So we won't be logged in at this point. So James and password. And what we should see here is, yep, we've just got the standard Express setup. So /users, there's just a message saying we're responding with a resource, which if we go and look at our, let's just close this down. If we go and look at the user's routes, you can see this is the message that's set up as a placeholder by default. So we're going to come and actually edit that file in just a second. But let's just have a look in Compass to see if everything's set up okay. So as I said, that database, that MongoDB collection wasn't actually set up beforehand. So we've got a user profiles database now set up, and inside there we've got a collection called users. And if we have a look at that now, you can see we've got my username that I created, and we've also got my hashed password. So obviously I wasn't typing in that to actually log in. So we know that our application is actually hashing passwords, saving them as hashed passwords, and also allowing us to log in with the hashed version as well. So that's pretty much working as we need it to at the moment, but we need to come back and actually create the user's routes so that we can actually start editing some data that the user wants to store for their profiles. So let's create all of the routes in here, and we'll keep the existing one that we've got here, but we're actually going to modify it somewhat. Let's just put this into an arrow function here, just so we keep everything the same. So instead of just responding with a resource, what we actually want to show here is the form so the user can edit their profile data. So we're first actually going to check if they're actually logged in or not. So we'll say if on our request object we've got a function called isAuthenticated. So if that's not the case, we need to redirect them back to the login page, which was our auth login. But if they are logged in at this point, what we can do is get a reference to the collection on app.locals. So this is the MongoDB collection that we referenced right at the start. And we'll also want to get the ID of the user as well, because we're actually going to need to find them in the database to actually make any changes. And we can actually import something else from the MongoDB library, which is a helper function called object ID, and that is here. And what this actually does is take a string representation of the user's ID and converts it into an object which MongoDB can actually use to find the user. So that sounds a little bit complicated, but just trust me, it needs to be done for it to work. So request session.passport, we've actually got access to the user, which we serialized right at the start as just the ID. So that should just give us the ID of the user in a string form. So on our users collection, we're going to find one user, and we're going to find them via their ID, which we've just created a second ago. And then we get a callback with the error and any results. So I'm not sure what we're going to do if we don't get an error. We should probably do a flash message or something. Maybe we'll come back to that before we finish the application. If we can't find the user, though, something's gone seriously wrong, because there's some problem with the code really here, because we've got the logged in user's ID. So we'll just leave it as a thrown message for the moment. So we're actually going to render the template called account, which we're going to create in a second. And we'll also pass all of the properties of the results that have come back. So this will be things like the GitHub profile, the Twitter profile, if that's actually been provided, if it's actually stored in the MongoDB collection already. So we'll come back to that in a second. Let's create some more routes. Let's create one for the actual public profile viewing. So this is the one that we don't actually need to check if the user's logged in or not. So we'll say router.get, and we'll use a path parameter here. So the username will be everything after /users. So the username can be provided after the user slash. So rec res next for our callback. And let's get a reference to our collection. And also we want to get the path parameter as well, which is on params, which is username. So once we've got the username and a reference to the collection, let's find that user in the database. And we're going to find them based on their username and get their results. So if we get an error, or the results is not a truthy object, as in we've not really found the user in the database, we'll render the template, which this one we're going to call just public profile, for example. And we're going to pass a message in there as well, a message object, which will go into our message partials. So we'll pass into the error property. What can we say? We can just say user not found, because that's most likely what's happened in that instance. And if that's not the case, if we haven't got an error or we've actually got some results come back, we'll render the same profile, the same template. So public profile, and this time we'll pass in all of the results that have come through, but we'll also pass in the username just so we can display that at the top of the page as well. And that will be for showing public profile data, and you can see we don't need to be authenticated to actually view that. Okay, so we'll also, while we're here, just create a post endpoint that handles the processing of the form if the user does decide to update their data. So we'll post and rec res next for our callback. And we'll say if they're not authenticated, is authenticated, we'll redirect them back to the login page. But if they are, what we need to do is actually update their data in the database. So we'll first get a reference to our collection, our users collection. So rec.app.locals.users. And we'll also, in our request body, we'll just access all of the information that the user is going to be provided to us. And we'll do that by destructuring the request body, just so we don't get any data that the user decides to pass to us, because that would be the danger if we were to just pass the whole of the request body to the update function with MongoDB. Oh, and we also need to get the ID of the user too, so that we can update them in the database. So we'll do the same thing again as we did before, using the object ID function. Let's just grab their ID for the currently logged in user out of the session. So we'll use the MongoDB update one function. So users update one, and we know their user ID, so we can find them in that way. And then we need to pass the strange format that MongoDB uses to do updates. So we say $set, and then the object inside of there is the data that we want to set for this user. So that'll be name, GitHub, and Twitter and Facebook. So those will be the fields that the user fills in their account. And again, we should probably do some kind of flash message here, but it's unlikely an error will happen, and we might want to crash the application if that does happen, so that we can stop anything else going wrong. And if everything goes okay, let's just log them, return them back to the user's profile. And that should be pretty much all we need in our routing file here. So let's go ahead and create the templates for the various different parts for the users pages. So first one we need one called account. And we also need one called public profile. And that's it pretty much, isn't it? So let's just create that other one now. Public profile. So let's just create the profile one now, and we'll just put a heading at the top there saying edit your profile. And with our form, we're just going to post data to the user's endpoint. So let's make sure our method is post. And a similar thing that we did before, let's just create some form groups that have got some labels and some input boxes in them. So the first one's name. And class of form control, and the name is going to be name. So that's what will come up in the request.body. And let's just set up the ID for the label as well. And we can just copy this now, and we'll just paste that a few times for the different fields that we're going to be using. So the first one was GitHub. And it's just, GitHub for those. And the next one is Twitter, for example. Oops, if I can spell. And the last one was Facebook. Of course, this could be any data really, just using it as an example for what the user might be actually saving in their profile. And of course, we need a button to actually save that. So button, again, same formatting as we did before, btn primary, and we'll just say update. And we did also on the existing demo app actually put a link to view that profile as well. So we can just put a link in there. And the link we'll be going to is users. Don't forget the path parameter is looking for the username. So we can just put the username in there using handlebars. And we'll also actually make sure it opens up into a new window. Not very scientific, but we'll just get them to open it up into a new tab by using target blank. View your profile. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the profile page. We need to go to the public profile now. So all we're going to do here really is list out the data that's stored within the actual user's record. So we'll actually get a flash message if the user's not found. So let's make sure we've got our messages partial. And we'll actually check and say if there's actually a username provided, because don't forget, if there was an error, we didn't actually provide a username, so we only want to show this data if there's no errors. So we'll just say the user name, I'll close that, username's profile is the header, and we'll actually just then create a table and give it the bootstrap class of table, and we'll do some rows here, and we're going to have 4 rows for the different fields that we've got stored, and each one will be name, and then it was GitHub, oops, if I can actually spell, and Twitter, and finally Facebook. Oops. And don't forget to close our if statement off with handlebars, because otherwise I'll complain at us later. And so we're going to get an error message if the user doesn't exist. If not, we're going to see all of their user profile data that they've entered. And that's the publicly available data that will just display everything in a table so that people can see it. So let's head over to the app and actually just check that this is working. So now if we refresh the page, we're actually logged out because the Express app has restarted. So let's log in. Okay, so now we're seeing edit your profile. So I'll just put my name in there and my profile details. And if I then click update, oh, so we've got an error there. So users 45. Let's go here. Oh, we didn't actually put the callback in here. We just, there we go. So error. Let's just put this onto another line so we can see that all in one place. So probably got some mismatching colons here now, so that's fine. Yep, okay, so let's restart. Maybe just reload the user's page. Let's just get a fresh profile thing and do that again, because it'll have restarted. Password. Yep, logged in. So try that one more time. Okay, so that went through okay. We should probably put a flash message up here, but we can come back to that later. And if we go back to view your profile, yep, we can see now that all of the data that we've saved is now in the profile. Now, the name one didn't seem to update there. Maybe I've got a typo somewhere else. But it'd be quite good actually in these form fields actually to display the existing data in there so that the user knows what's already in there when they're editing their profile. So we could do that in the account page just by simply setting the value property in here. So let's say value is equal to name, just some spaces, and value is equal to GitHub, and value is equal to Twitter, and finally for the Facebook one, okay, so that should display the data when we're actually on the page. So the name one didn't get saved for some reason. Maybe we've got a typo there. So let's just have a look at that. So where do we actually save the data? Oh, I called it names. That's why. So let's just change that back to there and there. So that should be okay now. So let's just try and need to restart the app. Oops, password. So if I save that now, take a look at the profile, Yep, okay, so we can see that's there. And let's just check that that 404, when we can't find a user, is working okay. So let's try. So that's not working very well. So we might have got an error here when we generate the template. Oh, so one thing is that the messages property isn't set. It should be messages, not message. So let's try and find a non-existing user again. So localhost users, Dave, for example. And that looks a bit better, yeah. So now we're getting the user not found. So the last thing we need to do really is just on the home page, because at the moment it's just a default Express homepage for us. We need to actually put that login and registration links, and also to list any recently registered users. So let's create the root first, just so that we can get the data from the database. So it's just going to be get the / URL, and we'll render the index template. We don't need to worry about the title too much. And what we'll actually do in there is get a reference to the users collection, locals .users. And on the users collection, we're going to find all items and limit that to, say, 3 of the most recent logins. And we'll convert that to an array, which actually allows us to get all of the data in the second variable, which I'm going to call recent. So let's just get that there. And we'll then render the index template. And we'll pass in those recent documents that have been saved into the collection. So that's the recently logged in, recently created users. So in the actual template for our index page, so the home page, let's just change this up a little bit. So we'll just call this user profiles for our application. And just get rid of that message. So we'll actually just check if there have been any recent user registrations, because that might be empty when it comes back for our first few calls. And if there are some recent users, let's just say recent user profiles, we'll create an unordered list, and inside there we'll just loop through all of those results that have come back from MongoDB. And we'll also put a link to their user profile, so their public user profile, based on their username, and we'll also just put the title of the link as their username too. So let's close off the each. Formatting is going a bit strange here. For our handlebars template, and also the if statements, because we don't want to leave that open. And we'll just put a couple of links to the login pages and the registration pages. href. So we want to go to auth login for the login page. To update your profile. And then finally for the register, for registrations, we'll say register an account. So as long as our Express app is still up and running, hopefully, let's reload the page here. And there you go, we can see the user profiles as our title, and you can see a list of recent users that have been created as well, and clicking on those takes us to that user profile. Let's just check our login is still working as well. Actually, let's create a new account. So let's just call it James2. And if we go back to the home page now, we should see that that's a recently, yep, so we've got a new user being registered there. And if we view their profile, currently empty, let's log in. And just put some random text in those and update it. And we'll just go back to the home page, and you can see James2's profile is there. So that's pretty much working as we had it in the demo app. I think the only thing we've left out is the logout button. So let's actually create that logout button. And I'll actually put that in the layout template because we want that to appear on every page if the user's actually logged in. So right before we put any other text on the page, let's just check the logged in property. So this, if we remember right at the start of our tutorial, in the apps.js file, we put a little bit of middleware just to set a value of logged in, and which is just checking the is authenticated function and assigning it to that value. So that's really handy because we can then just use it within our handlebars template. So if the user is logged in, what do we want to do? Well, we want to give them a link to the logout route, which we created in the auth routes routing folder. So we're just going to put a link there, and it's just going to be auth logout, which will actually do a redirect for us anyway, so we don't need to worry about that too much. Reload the page. Yeah, the login button it should be running. Let's just restart, refresh the page. Yeah, so we don't see the login button there. Let's actually try and log in and see if we can log out. Yeah, so you can see the logout button there. Let's just try that. And we're taken back to the home page and we're no longer logged in. So that brings an end to the user profiles application development, and hopefully you've learned a few things by going from a project from end to end. It's still really rough around the edges. Obviously, the user registration could be a bit smoother, and we might want to take some more information. And also, we'd probably want to register or confirm at least a user's email address so that we might want to contact them about their account, for instance. The other thing is some of the messaging could be improved as well, and it goes without saying that the styling needs updating as well. I'm sure you can come up with a much better design. So that's it for this lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorial updates.